Let's go back about 100 years from 1920 to 1933. A nationwide constitutional law prohibited the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol. The 18th Amendment created a ripple effect across the United States, leading to widespread bootlegging and smuggling efforts.
Then, with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, however, prohibition finally came to an end. These are just the bullet points. We would like to welcome back historian Mike Dixon, who is here to dig a little bit deeper into how this transition took place. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
So let me ask you this. What did prohibition do to the nation?
Well, if you can imagine, take downtown Salisbury. You're sitting there on a January night in 1920, and the bartender comes along at the Wicomico or someplace like that and says, "Drink up, Jimmy. We're closing at midnight." You might have said, "Well, what are we closing early for? You're always up until 2 or 3 o'clock. He says, "Haven't you heard the 18th Amendment, Prohibition? It's going to be illegal to manufacture, sell, distribute alcohol." Imagine what a disruption that was for people all across the country and Delmarva.
Yeah.
But seems like that would have played out in Salisbury and all over the shore.
So I imagine it was not a pretty sight. I mean, what happened when Prohibition?
Yeah, so a few things happen. So it's January 1920 that it becomes the law of the land. The country was pretty dry. The Delmarva was sort of dry, pretty dry for the period, because it kind of disrupted the market. But it wasn't too long before there's a quote out of one of the Dover papers. So you could drive through the back roads of Sussex County on a moonless night, and you didn't need to have a light because you could all the stills working in the woods. Pretty soon, enterprise set in, and maybe for 6-9 months, a year, something like that, it was disrupted. Remember, we're going to do this for 14 years. But enterprise filled in, and there becomes an underground distribution system. And Delmarva was with the coast and all that kind of thing, was in rural areas.
How about that? What was the beer bill?
So we go for 13 years, almost 14 years, when Prohibition's the law of the land, but it's not working, Jimmy.
Yeah.
I mean, as we go from year 1, 2, 3, organized crime's getting into it, the Delaware coast. You've had Jim Duffy, and I hear him talk about some great Delaware coast stories, you know? And things, and people recognize it. Great Depressions come on, we've closed good jobs, government could use a little revenue. So there's this really unpopular president, very unpopular. His name's Hoover, because it also overlays with the Great Depression. And FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, runs as a Democrat against this unpopular guy, and he says, "I am going to repeal Prohibition." So he gets elected. Now, it's complicated because we'd amended the Constitution, which was what the Women's Christian Temperance Union wanted. They didn't want this to be easy to change with the whim of a legislator. So he says, "I'm going to appeal Prohibition." Well, that's a complicated process, but the bill did not define what was alcohol. So he could do an adjustment on a bill and allow for 3.2% beer. So administratively, with the stroke of a pen and the change of an administrative law, he brings back beer. So that same downtown Salisbury, and a day in April 1933, he might have come up to you, Lisa, and he might have said, "Well, you know, I can serve you beer now, it's 3.2%. FDR was able to bring us beer back. Now that's April. We still got Prohibition, but that was adjusting a law that dealt with the percentage of alcohol.
How about that? Okay. I didn't know that.
How else was Delmarva involved in the Prohibition?
So it was involved in a lot of ways. For instance, especially Delaware. Delaware, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was really bothered that we weren't so compliant. So they kept complaining to the federal government. And they sent a man named Three Gun Wilson from Pittsburgh out to enforce the law in Delaware. He's the federal revenue agent doing the enforcement. Yeah, he liked to carry 3 guns. He wasn't publicity shy. He knew how to get the spotlight because he'd do as much promotion from what I can see. But he's working all up and down through here. Seems like every time he got down to Sussex County, though, they were gone. And then the coastal fleet of the boats and stuff like that. I don't think, Lisa, too many people wanted. If you wanted it, it was getting awfully easy to find in the second half.
Interesting.
Wow. So any lasting effects?
Yeah, a lot of lasting effects. So the Great Depression's on, crime's becoming a problem, organized crime, and so FDR says, I'd like to create some jobs. I think it'd be a good time for a beer, was an exact quote. So he does that, and he begins working to get the 21st Amendment that will repeal all prohibition. That passes, and in December, you could have been back at the Wicomico, and the bartender says, Jimmy, you were a good customer 14 years ago. Welcome back. I can now serve you. Now, even though the law went into effect, it took a few weeks before the distribution channels caught up. And then it gives us, you ask about lasting effects. For instance, the state liquor control boards.
Okay.
Look around the nation, Pennsylvania's state liquor system. All this stuff is a direct legacy. Maybe you remember when we couldn't sell alcohol on Sundays.
Right.
All of those regulations, the licensing and everything, are direct legacy of that. Some states are very open. New York's very open. Pennsylvania was a little bit tighter. Maryland somewhere in between.
Interesting. Mike Dixon.
How about that?
Always love it when you come and talk to us.
No kidding.